Hi, Dex Gelfand here, and my practice is known as Therapeutic Spiritual Counseling. And today's topic is relevance and rabbit holes. I will explain. And what I want to talk about is the basic values and non-values to what we call processing. It's a counseling term that is mostly known through the subject of Scientology, which is part of my background. I'm not a Scientology auditor, but it is part of my background. It's part of my matrix that I learned from and evolved out of. There are parts that I think are valuable, and there are parts that I think are not valuable, and there are parts that I think are misleading and maybe at best a waste of time and at worst a misdirection into feelings and attitudes that are less than helpful. So anyway, relevance and rabbit holes. One particular audience that I want to speak to now, but not only, is my fellow practitioners, people who are engaged in some sort of counseling practice that bears some similarity or commonality with mine, okay, which includes my Scientology friends. Now, the way I see it, counseling or processing, or whatever you want to call it, it should address and help to resolve relevant material. Well, what does that mean? Relevant material means things that are actually what you're trying to solve, what you're trying to change. Things that will actually make a difference in how you feel every day and how well you function every day, and have an impact on others, and be different even through the objective eyes of others, for the most part. Okay. Now, a lot of processing or counseling can seem to be effective, but not truly in relevant ways. Sort of a parlor trick. I will refer you to now to Scientology. In the Scientology's technical dictionary, they have a definition of auditing, which is Scientology's word for the counseling and the techniques used and so forth. And one of the definitions is to trigger or stimulate or re-stimulate charged material in a person in order to de-stimulate it. And that is the opposite of relevance to me, because to me, I feel that my job as a therapeutic spiritual counselor is to facilitate the successful addressing of those items that you have on your mind to change or fix or do something about. So by very definition, that would not mean things that somebody would have to trigger in you, because they're already triggered. So to me, any counseling, any techniques, any therapeutic approach that involves asking for some sort of material that you're not already expressing in some way is pretty much a waste of time. Now, that can be done, it is done very often, for instance, in Scientology, to using their e-meter device. And I will say this about that device. It's not a joke. It actually does show where there is charged material that a person has. It's not 100% infallible. And I think it's more of an educational tool to understand what's happening in a person's mind as you're training to be a counselor, and not so much something that should be used in a session where the idea of it seems to be to subsume authority in deciding what is or isn't important to address, or what is or isn't true. That is very disempowering, when we should be granting those abilities to the individual who is there to receive sessions, so that he can develop and find his confidence and trust his instincts better. And the same applies for the Scientology auditor or counselor. Get that e-meter out of the way. Get that supposed crutch out of the way. And let that counselor or auditor interact directly and see what he sees for himself and learn to trust it. So anyway, my point here being that it's not that difficult to find something in a person that you can draw their attention to, which does have emotional charge to it, and then allow them to process it so that they feel better. And a feeling of release, a feeling of euphoria. On that meter, you'd see what's called a drifting back and forth, what they call a floating needle. And there would be a sense that something has been accomplished. And there's, again, that feeling of euphoria, a release that goes with it. In my observation, that can become somewhat of an addictive thing that customers just want more of. And it becomes a substitute criteria for true progress. That feeling of release, of a floating needle, of having apparently resolved something, when that something wasn't something you came into the session concerned about, it's a bit of a trick. And there's a lot of processing that works that way, where you get the appearance that something meaningful has occurred, but really not so much, because when those kind of things are done, there's no real change in the person. They will come back for session after session after session, complaining of the same sort of circumstances, but somehow at the same time, perhaps carrying forward this delusion that something great has been happening in the processing, when there's been no real change in the person's functionality, in their mood level, in how happy they are, or in how they're going through life and the things that seem to be happening to them. So we don't want to do that. What we want to have happen is when you come in front of your counselor, if you're one of my participants, then it's all about what's on your mind. What would you like to do something about? What do you feel a need to solve or change? Tell me about that, and we'll go right into that. And we'll do something about that, and it will be different by the time we end the session. Maybe not completely resolved, because it can lead to a whole chain of related material, but it will be right on the money, following your spiritual compass of exactly what needs to be addressed, what is within your realm of consciousness, something that is relevant and important to you. That's what matters. While I'm touching on that subject and touching on things like Scientology, let me bring to mind another, what I would call a false criteria. The first false criteria being the idea of coming into a session, have something stirred up by the counselor that wasn't even on your mind in the first place, going through the feelings that are associated with that and coming out of it at the end, feeling released from it and having a sense of euphoria, which is nice but not relevant in that nothing changes. Okay? Well, a circumstance that is related to that occurs when people do what's called solo processing very often. I see this happen, and I see this also happen very often. This is a focus of Scientology. When the material that is dredged up, that comes to the surface, comes from distant past lives. Now, sometimes things can be found, and people often do find material from past lives coming up in session. It's not at all unusual. I'm not asking you to believe in it, agree with me, or otherwise. It's an observation. It comes up very frequently. But I think in some things, and Scientology is one of them, there's this false conflating, like the further back in time something is, or the more fantastical the narrative attached to it is, the more meaningful it is. That's just not true. How meaningful something is entirely a matter of how relevant it is, what it has to do with what you want to understand or change about yourself that results in some changes in how well you function, as I've been saying, how good you feel, how well you operate, how your life changes, and how you are observably different and how things go better for you. That's what I call relevant. And that's what you're looking for, I think. That's what all my participants have always been looking for. So what happens instead is there's this false, misleading emphasis on the unbelievable, the fantastic, something that happened a million years ago, by mere fact of it happening when the physics of the world themselves seemed to be different, or it was a different world or a different universe. There's so much wow to that, okay? But in all honesty, in my observation from thousands and thousands of hours of assisting participants in sessions and seeing what really makes a difference, the most meaningful and impactful material, not 100% of the time, but generally most of the time, that makes changes in the person, helps them really resolve things and be different and feel better and operate better, come from, more than any other period of time, they come from early childhood. Not all the time, as I said, but dramatically, that's the majority of where it comes from. I will say that it can also come from any point in your existence, but most commonly, that's where it usually is. Okay? Now, there's also things that happen more recently. There's moments of shock. There's big changes in a person's life, losing a loved one, or things like that. Very extremely traumatic, shocking experiences can happen at any time. But the things that seem to have the overall most pervasive effects on us that need to be changed, that limit us and hurt us, mostly come from early childhood. Second after that, I would say, is late in the previous life. That's also an area where a lot of impactful material comes from, but nowhere near as much as early childhood. And when these other experiences come up, where things were very different in other places and times from hundreds of thousands of years ago or millions of years ago, or there's this thing people have that they attach to spirituality, where it's like there's a status thing where people will say, well, I know I'm a very old soul, a very old spirit. Well, the rest of us didn't just get off the bus now. We all are very unique individuals. We all have a great depth of spirituality and spiritual history in us. It's not a competition, and it's not about status, but I see that is very much attached to it, and it seems like it's very common for us to feel some need to grant ourselves some elevated status, which more than anything else suggests that we haven't been granted the appropriate recognition in our daily lives or in our early childhood. But anyway, it's sort of what I would call a rabbit hole when the focus goes more and more and more, and based on things that happened millions and billions and trillions of years ago in other galaxies and universes and places. These things are not so relevant. I'm not denying that such things can be, in fact, actual. Far from it. I'm not denying that. Whether or not that seems realistic or fantastic to you or not. Such things are and can be real. They're just really not that important. For the most part, they're not that important. Occasionally, it's something that really has stayed with a person, that is affecting them in their present existence. That can happen, but not so much as people think. Now, in that same vein, I want to talk with you about the idea of solo processing, or using a technique yourself. In Scientology, it's called solo auditing, and there's quite a bit of emphasis on that. The idea being that when a person gets to a certain level, I'm not a great promoter or believer in the idea of levels, and sort of the implication that you get up to this point and you're holier than thou, or something like that. I find that most techniques, the techniques I use, will work with any person. You don't need to be of any particular background or level. But anyway, talking about the solo processing, I do have a good number of participants who have worked with me who, in between sessions or before they were working with me or after, They feel a little more capable of just directing their own processing and doing it themselves because of their knowledge and experience. And of course, I guess there's definitely a financial component to that. You don't have to charge yourself anything to give yourself a session. And I don't want to say that there's no value in solo processing, but this is what I see happening with every single person that I see doing this, is that there can be exceptions, all right, but for the most part, you're spinning your wheels. For the most part, what happens is you can find all kinds of apparently meaningful things and get that feeling of euphoria, that sense of release, okay, but again, without any real changes. Still having the same conditions, the same moods, the same attitudes, the same life problems. So then what good is that? And again, it has its attendant rabbit holes, just like in common Scientology, the idea of finding something from millions of years ago in some strange and exotic universe somewhere else, way down the time track. You know, people tend to stick themselves into those things when they do their solo processing. And so the problem with it, the way I see it, is that if you are running your own session, and the real goal is to find relevant material that's going to fix the things you want to fix about yourself, change what you feel you need to change, resolve the things that are disturbing. You know, that I believe is more or less the goal. Well, the problem with doing that solo is that you're directing what you're going to address, how much you're going to address it, and what you find, all through the filters of those spiritual architectures and that charged material that is going to color where you go, what you see, and what effect it has, and how you interpret it. And that's the problem with solo processing, is that the very material that you need to process is that material which is filtering how you see what you're doing in your session and how you direct it. It's a distinct disadvantage, and it sort of tends to mislead you. I have seen so many of my participants who do solo processing go into those rabbit holes, and they'll have a lot to say about their thoughts and ideas, and how the narratives, the stories that come up and things like that. But what you don't see is any change of characteristic in the person's behaviors, in the person's attitude or moods, in the emotions, in the conditions that the person's experiencing. Again, it's misleading. You can feel like you've really found something, but most of the time it doesn't really result in any change. And it does throw you into misleading rabbit holes that these filters of your own spiritual architectures, being the very things you need to process, being there coloring your perceptions, create the problem. So if you're one of these individuals who's done a lot of this processing, and you've got great stories from way down the time track of things you've learned and realized about yourself and so forth, ask yourself this: are you still having the same sort of life situations, the same sort of relationship issues, the same sort of logistic, financial situations, still held back the same way? Are these changes not translating into greater functionality for you? That's changing how you operate and the things that happen to you and for you and around you. That's the question to ask. So yes, I'm being a bit discouraging now about trying to process things yourself, which I don't mean to say that you shouldn't think about things or consider things or try to solve things yourself. Of course you're going to. Even when you're being a participant with me, believe me, it's you doing that. I'm not doing it for you. But it's just in a context that helps you to simply experience your own spiritual compass and the material that is instinctually being presented by you for you. There's something about that context that helps you stay on the right road and not be taken down to any of those filters into a rabbit hole. We want to avoid the rabbit holes. So first of all, I want to suggest that if you're going to do your own solo processing, that you don't do more than a session or two without coming back to me or whoever your primary counselor is to go over the material and make sure that you continue to process in a relevant direction and help you get out of the rabbit holes that you might get into doing that. Another thing is I have some suggestions about how to go about your solo processing. See, when you look for narratives and answers and stories that explain things, that's just not the way it works. By looking for those things is not how you find the answers. The primary way you make changes and find the material you need to find is the part that is very resistant when you try to do it by yourself. It's the actual pain and force, the forces and negative sensations that you are naturally repelled from experiencing. When you try to work around those and just look for ideas, the ideas behind those things, the stories behind where these forces manifested, the things that left you in shock, that left you in pain, these things are not easily permeated solo because you have a natural built-in resistance. That's what these spiritual architectures create. And you yourself create efforts to resist pain and sadness and heartbreak and shock. So in your solo processing, you're largely trying to go around that. And it's just misleading, and that's how you get into the rabbit holes. So what can you do? Well, what you can do, and I have clients do this in session all the time, is when some charged material comes up for you, just sit with it. Just let it express within you rather than trying to do something to or about it. If you consider, your painfully charged material, the things that make you fearful or shamed or embarrassed, okay? Any really strong emotion, which is going to be very off-putting when you try and find what's behind it, just experience it. Your strongest charged emotions are like a person trying to express himself, and you're trying to avoid it because it's painful. So they continue forward through time. They hang fire for you because what you're trying to do is find a way around it, and that doesn't work. The simple truth is, these really strong feelings, these sadnesses and fears and guilt and shame and such things, essentially think of it this way: they're merely energy. They're really just energies. That's all they are. They're just energies. And they're your energies. So, this is another mistake that I see happen in Scientology and with solo processing, is this whole, what I feel is very misleading direction that your feelings, your unwanted feelings or sensations come from some other degraded spiritual beings, that you have an impossible number of these hovering and infesting your personal space, and you have to track them down and get them to go away. That is one processing philosophy, what's called body thetans or entity processing. And I'm sorry, but I have seen far, far too many examples, people coming to me after going that route. And that may be the worst rabbit hole of all, because it disconnects a person from owning their own material, their own creations, and their own energy, and instead assigning it to an external source. No, processing is all about integrating your own material, owning it, accepting it, and letting it digest within you. It is not about spotting some other sovereign source of your feelings. I know it's a very common idea, and I'm not discounting the fact that we do have spiritual connections with other people and beings that aren't necessarily physical in nature. Sure, I haven't the slightest doubt. I know that to be a fact. But to assign your conditions to this tale that's been spread through Scientology, and not only Scientology, but other things, that ultimately your thoughts are created or influenced completely by these entities or body thetans. That's a Scientology term. Just that you're infested with all these degraded spiritual beings who cannot maintain a body of their own, so they're all clumped together in big clusters inside you. That may sound ridiculous to you. It sounds ridiculous to me, but it is a very, very basic tenet of what they call the confidential levels of Scientology, and they appear in other things too. The idea did not originate with Scientology, but it's become a huge part of it. And again, it's one of those things where you can have a feeling of euphoria and release in working that way for a little while, but you're only going to find more and more of these things, and no real change occurs. Your functionality doesn't change. And I've had so many participants come to me. Really, it's a big number who have tried that with another practitioner or even alone. And again, it becomes a terrible rabbit hole of increasingly finding what feels like very terrifying influences and so forth. And I've had clients where the toughest thing was to try and get them out of that realm of thought once they were in it. Sure, I can give anybody a session and relieve them of what's impinging on them in the moment. That's what I do, and I'm very good at it. But when a person is indoctrinated or implanted into reframing their own feelings and tendencies and obsessions and compulsions as not being their own and looking for who's putting it into them and make them go away. Yeah, you do hit into levels of insanity with that. You hit into a lot of disappointment and a lot of desperation the longer it goes on. So I'm sorry to offend those people who are friends or just other people who believe in that or who practice that. But I feel like I've got to be honest about that. I see it happen way too frequently to continue not to comment on it. And so I'm telling you flat out, if you're on that road of a philosophy that looks to explore and explain all the things that are disturbing to you as not coming from you, but being some other being that is somewhere in or around you that has to be persuaded to leave or something like that, there's a basic danger in that you don't actually arrive at responsibility and owning your own created material. And so it doesn't really ever resolve. As fantastic as it feels when the feeling seems to release, it always comes back, and it can come back harder. Okay, so that's a prime example of a rabbit hole. So now let me go back to explaining what you can do on your own when you've got a disturbing feeling. The impulse, the reaction, is to try to resist it in some way. But you know what actually works, and like I was just starting to say a few minutes ago, I do this with my clients in sessions, is sit with it. Try this. Allow that feeling to present itself. If it is here, then allow it to fully express within you. Just be completely effortless. Relax every muscle in your body. Unclench your mind. Don't be resistive. And as this feeling comes to the surface and expresses itself, just allow it. Let it do that. Like I started to say, it's like a person who's trying to express something, and you're trying to deny it, and you're refusing to listen, and you're ignoring, or you're making them shut up, or getting away from that. It doesn't work, because those chronic feelings of fear, frustration, sadness, depression, they're not going to be resolved that way. All you need to do to get some relief is to allow it to fully express within you. Let it digest like food in your stomach. Just be here, completely effortless. Allow it to be and express within you. You're feeling it diminishing. Allow it to do that. This is not a process of trying to find it or pull it in or strengthen it or anything like that. You just take what is actually presenting for you, what you're feeling, and just allow it to express. That's all you do. It's really a technique of doing nothing. You're not doing anything. You're not bringing on the feelings. You're not pushing them away. You're not making them do anything. All you need to do is let those energies, and again, it's just energy. That's all it is, it's energy, and it will diminish and disperse if you allow it to fully express. Like if you let somebody say what they feel they need to say to you, then they'll stop screaming. It's very much like that. Okay? So that's something you can do for yourself. And that's not going to get you into any rabbit holes. Don't be looking for some narrative behind the feeling or assume that you know what it is or even care what it is. Whatever happens to come to you naturally in the process of allowing this feeling of terror or anger or depression, whatever it is, to just express. You might get images, you might get incidents come into your mind, other people may come into your mind, and that's fine. You don't need to rush to frame that as the entire explanation for whatever you're doing, assume that it is, or anything like that. Because you can find any number of narratives of past incidents and that come up in doing this. And they're coming up because they all express that same energy, that same feeling of fear or depression or whatever it is that we're processing in the moment. That's why they're coming up. They're all part of that. So you simply allow that to express. Let it naturally dissolve and diminish within you. Just kind of spiritually swallow it. And again, that means to be completely effortless. That's all you do. And if you're a person that wants to see what you can accomplish for yourself in your own sessions or in between your sessions, whether or not you're a trained counselor of any kind, that's the whole technique right there. Anybody can do that. That is something that you can do. Besides that, I've also made 2 other videos called Who Wants to Have Fun and Who Wants to Have More Fun. And in both of those, I give you techniques that I'm actually giving you the directions in the video, and you can pause the video between directions to make sure you fully complete the step I've just given before I start to give you the next step. Those are things you can do, and I think you'll find that much more successful, if perhaps not as fascinating as some of the rabbit holes that you will get into when you try to direct your own processing towards specific stories or narratives or whatever, okay? Or, again, to look for entities or other beings, okay? Again, I'm advocating steering clear of that. If in your processing of something like that expresses itself, now that's a different thing. You just take whatever you get. You don't need to have anybody explain it to you, indoctrinate you in their way of looking at it, okay, to frame it in a certain way that has you looking for certain things in particular instead of just taking what you get. Take what you get. And just be willing to experience it. Be completely effortless. Don't try to push it, pull it, change it. You don't need to. Any of those things are what you call counter efforts. You're using energy against energy instead of just letting the energy exhaust itself and express. When you have energy against energy, things get very solid and formidable. They don't release, they don't dissolve. That's the opposite of releasing and resolving and dissolving. Take what you get, be effortless, relax, let it express itself. You're in no danger. It's just merely energy. Allow that energy to express within you, and you will feel it dissolve, and you will find relief. And beyond that, come see me. You know where to find me, or somebody else that you have confidence in. I hope this is helpful.